morning to you too. Hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Amusement Adventures, the series where I document my day at a park, reviewing the rides I rode, the food I ate, and even the journey to get there. I'll cover it all. And in this action-packed episode, we are heading to the sunny Mission Bay area to visit Seaworld San Diego, and it's sure to be a very fun day. But before we embark on our adventure, let me give you a bit of a rundown of the history of this iconic sea life park. Opening in 1964 by 4 graduates of UCLA, Seaworld San Diego was originally planned to be an underwater restaurant. However, this concept was considered to be an impossibility at the time, so instead, the 4 decided to open a marine zoological park. This park was a huge success, eventually spawning 3 other locations, 2 of which are still open today, and in 2005, the park changed forever when it added its first roller coaster, starting the process of the park becoming the full-fledged theme park it is today, and the park that I will be visiting today. So once again, I rolled out of bed to get ready for the incredible day that was to come. The morning started out simply enough with me taking a shower and brushing my teeth. I then went on SeaWorld's website to see if any rides were planned to be closed for the day. So nothing is actually scheduled to be closed today. That doesn't mean something will still break down. The only thing that is actually supposedly closed is Tidal Twister, which I actually don't mind because then I don't have to ride a Skyline Attractions ride, and I don't have to debate with you guys whether or not I should count it as a credit. So honestly, that's a win for me. A lot like Knott's, that doesn't necessarily mean rides won't break down while we're there, but it is a really good sign that for most of the day the rides should be open. And after that was taken care of, all that was left to do was to slip on my shoes and step outside. Morning, Governor. What? As per usual, it is absolutely gorgeous outside today. It definitely was, and it would be just as lovely in San Diego, with temperatures that day hopefully just barely in the 60s. But before we could enjoy that amazing weather, we had to get to the park, and that's where this guy comes in. He's the one who will be driving us to the park. Oh, and he's also my dad. He's my dad. Boogie woogie woogie. My dad and I would also be joined by my brother Kyler, whose love for aquatic animals is so strong that he will actually come out of his room to see them. And now that we were all together, all that was left to do was pile into the car to begin our journey to the park. For breakfast at a lovely little roadside drive-through coffee shop / diner and got some excellent food before moving on, getting closer to our destination. Eventually, we could just see the roller coasters peeking over the horizon, making us all the more excited to get into the park. After parking, we were greeted with the wonderful sight of Electric Eel and Emperor testing. That's ridiculous. And the sight of pretty much an empty parking lot, signaling that this would be a very dead day. And after getting all our stuff together, we hurriedly walked up to the entrance of the park. This park's entrance is absolutely incredible. It's adorned with a massive wave that you walk under that absolutely sets the tone for your day. And once you're in the park, you're almost immediately greeted with sea life in the form of touch pools. My favorite of these touch pools are the cleaner fish, little fish that will eat the dead skin off your hands when you stick them in the water. It was a bizarre but funny feeling that I can only describe as how TV static would feel. And while the touch pools were certainly a fun little stop, we moved on fairly quickly to get in line for our very first ride of the day, Manta. The entrance sign for Manta is honestly stunning. The coaster dives under the path to the ride's entrance and around some incredible rockwork. The first thing we did was buy a locker to store all our items that could not fit in our pockets. We got the locker for 4 hours so we could leave our stuff there while we walked around the park. Then we walked into the queue line for Manta. The queue begins with a staircase where we could see the coaster whiz past us on our right, before entering an underground room with some awesome fish tanks to our left. The queue then pops out into a lush Polynesian valley where the coaster was surrounding us. This portion of the queue is absolutely breathtaking. Lush tropical plant life surrounded us as we traversed our way up to the station. The station itself is also very nicely themed, looking just like a structure you would find in an old Polynesian village. And so, after we had walked the entire queue without stopping once, we boarded our incredibly comfortable Mock Rides trains, pulled down our lap bars, and set out for a ride through the tide on Manta. Manta begins with a right-hand turn out of the station into a pre-show. Projectors will project an underwater scene with mantas racing overhead. The trains will also rock back and forth in this area, simulating the flow of the tide. The music will build and get more intense until suddenly you're blasting off into the ride's layout. The launch itself was far more powerful than I was expecting, and was way more powerful than the other mock launch coaster that I have ridden in Time Traveler at Silver Dollar City. It actually has some punch to it, though not nearly as much as something like Powder Keg or Accelerator. After the slightly punchy launch, you enter into an overbank with a little bit of positive G's, but what really surprised me with this element is the second part. You twist out of this element and dive under the path to the entrance, getting a great head chopper effect. But this element is particularly better experienced in the back, as you actually get some pretty strong floater airtime getting pulled out of the overbank into the dive. After this, the train passes through another elevated turn, this time wrapping around the rockwork for Manta's entrance sign. This turn actually pulls some pretty strong positive G's, much more than the previous overbank, and you get some nice head choppers. But despite how forceful the positives are on this element, I don't think it's the strongest on the ride. Those will come later. After this powerful turnaround, the train flies through a low-to-the-ground turn into 2 back-to-back twisting camelbacks that give some okay floater airtime in most rows. Then you'll traverse a sort of S-bend that has a little bit of whip to it into the brakes before the second launch. These brakes slow the train down very quickly, so make sure to brace yourself here if you ride, as it can be a little bit uncomfortable sometimes. You then hit the second launch, and this one has even more punch than the first. This launches you into my 4 favorite elements on the ride, which all happen to be back to back to back. The first of these is a low-to-the-ground turn, which absolutely snaps you into it. This looks like an element right out of Maverick at Cedar Point, and it feels very aggressive. You almost get some faint sideways airtime during the snap, it's that aggressive. After the turn, you fly over an airtime hill. Now, this hill does feature a trim brake, but I really did not feel it affected the ride that much. You lose a little bit of speed, but this absolutely does not affect the insane airtime this element gives. It's solid ejector airtime, and you can feel it in every row. After this, you turn into a switchback hill, and this hill gives the most powerful airtime on the entire ride, combined with some whip from the switchback motion. After the impressively powerful switchback hill, you careen through a low-to-the-ground helix. This is the moment I mentioned earlier. This moment gives some very forceful positive G's. Apparently this ride pulls 4 G's, and if it does, it has to be right here. This helix, however, is basically the last crazy moment of the ride, as all that's left is a few meandering turns into the brake run, concluding your ride on Manta. This ride is honestly incredible. The ride has fantastic theming and pulls some great forces for its size. This ride is easily the best family coaster I've ever been on, scoring a 9 out of 10. After our ride on Manta, we were all itching to see some animals, so we went over to our first exhibit of the day, the shark encounter. The walkway into the building of the shark encounter had some nice tropical foliage and flowing water, but the real treat began once we entered the building. The theming inside was amazing. It was like we walked right into the shores of a lush Pacific island. The pools inside were filled with sharks, and deep below the water you could see the outline of the famous shark tunnel. After we had our fill of the shark pools from above, we went down a ramp to see them from below. The shark tunnel really is as cool as it sounds. We were completely surrounded by sharks on all sides, and there were a ton of them. It was really cool to see. The shark encounter is a really well done exhibit, and I really enjoyed it. I think this attraction deserves a solid 8 out of 10. Right next door to the shark encounter is another well done exhibit called Turtle Reef. The turtles are awesome to look at, and they even had a fun little turtle video game you could play when exiting the exhibit. Turtle Reef gets a 6 out of 10. Up next, we decided to head to the penguin encounter. There were some cool penguins outside native to South America, but the real show was inside. The building was freezing, and behind the glass there were hundreds of emperor penguins. This exhibit is a blast, and probably a great way to cool off on a hot day. This exhibit gets a 7 out of 10. Right next to the penguin encounter was the building for the old Wild Arctic Simulator Dark Ride, and while that ride is now gone, the Wild Arctic exhibit that accompanied it was still there. And out of all the exhibits, this one was my favorite so far. It has some fantastic theming, looking like an Arctic research center or a frozen shipwreck, and the whole thing has a really neat feel. Not to mention the animals like beluga whales, walruses, and otters were incredible, my favorite of which was for sure the walrus. I really hope this area gets that rumored Intamin motorbike coaster. That would just be the cherry on top for this awesome exhibit, which easily scores an 8.5 out of 10. Now, while we were in the Wild Arctic exhibit, we noticed Emperor in the distance, and how the exhibit actually made Emperor look themed. The ride looked so good that we could not wait any longer to hop on it. So, we walked to the Emperor Plaza, underneath the entrance sign, to get a ride on this thrilling dive machine. Emperor's queue itself is honestly very bare, and I would not want to wait in it for more than 10 minutes. There is little to no theming or shade, and it's honestly my biggest complaint with the ride, the lack of any atmosphere. The ride was simply plopped down, and the station, well, there isn't one. It's just a boarding platform, which is really disappointing. But after we made it through the mediocre queue, we boarded some not-so-mediocre trains. You see, a lot of people seem to hate the B&M vest restraints found on so many of their new rides, but I, for one, don't mind them at all. They are comfortable and I can still feel the forces. Though, keep in mind, I have not experienced dive coasters with the traditional over-the-shoulder restraints, so maybe if I experienced those, my opinion would change. But for now, I have no issue with the vest restraints that we pulled down to begin our ride on Emperor. The ride begins with a straight right-hand turn out of the station into the lift hill that pulls you up to the top of the ride very fast. You cruise around a turn at the top of the lift hill, getting an amazing view of the Mission Bay area and downtown San Diego, before being pointed directly at the beach, tilting down. You're hung over the drop for around 3 seconds before the train releases, plummeting you down the vertical drop. In the back, the drop delivers some great airtime, and in the front, the sense of speed is really accentuated. This drop is certainly the highlight of the ride. The valley of this drop actually delivers some pretty great positive Gs, and that's something I haven't really seen talked about with this ride. The positives in this ride's valleys are really good. Definitely not bone-crushing, but very present and fun. After the valley, you go into the ride's first inversion, the Immelman inversion. Now, I've never been a big fan of Immelmans, and this one is no exception. It just does nothing for me. It's too fast to give any hang time, and it's not fast enough to give any positives or whip. The train then smoothly transitions into a hammerhead turn that gives faint positives. Then you fly through a slightly whippy barrel roll that almost reminds me of something like the step-up underflip at Joker at Six Flags Discovery Kingdom. After that, you traverse a flat spin inversion, giving faint hang time before turning smoothly into the brakes. And when I say smoothly, I mean smoothly. This ride is incredibly smooth from start to finish and is incredibly re-rideable. Overall, Emperor is a fun coaster with a fantastic drop and some forces, but its score is knocked down because of its lack of theming, atmosphere, and station. Overall, Emperor gets a 7.5 out of 10. Really fun coaster, but lackluster presentation. After hopping off Emperor, we were all getting a little hungry, so we started looking around for some food options, and while we were doing that, we passed the entrance to Electric Eel. I noticed, like most of the rides in the park today, Electric Eel was a walk-on, so I decided to quickly hop on and get a ride on this electrifying coaster. Electric Eel's entrance sign really makes a great first impression with its impressive rockwork in blue letters. The rest of the queue is also really nice, with rockwork and some lovely tropical plants. The station is not anything special, but at least this ride has one. Boarding the trains, I quickly realized how cumbersome these trains are to actually board. I had been in a ride with similar restraints and trains to these with West Coast Racers at Magic Mountain, and they were just as bad. The trains are tight, and comfort collars are annoying to get into. Other than the fact that they are hard to get into, the comfort collars actually don't bother me. They don't touch your shoulders, and they certainly don't prohibit the ride's forces. The thing that does bother me ever so slightly is the tightness of the trains. The forces of the ride can make these tight trains feel just a little bit uncomfortable. But once I had finally gotten into these annoyingly tight trains, it was time to blast off into the electrifying layout of Electric Eel. Electric Eel begins by gently launching you out of the station. You stall out halfway and fall backwards before being launched backwards through the station and up half a non-inverting loop. After stalling out again at the top of the non-inverting loop, you fall down once again, but this time forwards, blasting through the station and flying all the way up to the highest point of the ride. You sharply crest to level out. The crest provides some of the strongest ejector airtime I have felt. It is so strong you can even feel the airtime before you begin to crest. After you crest, you begin to twist into an ultra-slow barrel roll filled with hang time, and this hang time is accentuated by the fact that you are 150 feet in the air. After the slow barrel roll, you drop down an insanely steep drop, giving insane airtime in every row, but even stronger airtime in the back. You then traverse the entirety of the non-inverting loop. This element is not very extreme, but it does offer a nice twisting sensation. After the non-inverting loop, you fly through the station one last time, go partially up the first set of track, and then fall back into the station, ending your ride. Electric Eel is a fantastic and forceful ride. However, its short length and uncomfortably tight trains bring it down slightly. Electric Eel scores a 7 out of 10. Though it is short, it packs a fantastic punch, but the uncomfortable trains make it hard to board and can hinder the ride experience. After I hopped off the ride, I was happy to find that my dad and my brother had found a place to eat, Explorer's Cafe. I got a burger, without the bun, as I can't eat gluten, with all the toppings and waffle fries. I would say it was a slightly above average theme park burger, scoring a 6 out of 10. While we were eating, we had noticed a lot of the clouds that had been there before had gone away, and by now it was getting a little hot. Not much, but enough for us to think it was time to ride our first water ride of the day, and my last new coaster at the park, Journey to Atlantis. Journey to Atlantis has an impressive entrance facade, with the towering buildings housing the ride's first drop, the massive pool where the ride's slow flume section takes place, and the impressive Atlantis sign that looks like something right out of the Disney movie. The queue itself has some decent theming as well. The trains have a nice boat-like look to them, and they are quite comfortable. The ride begins by ascending a very clackety lift hill to the top of the ride. Once you crest, you drop into a right-hand turn that actually has some weird outward banking to it. Now, for some unknown reason, this turn is pretty rough. It jolts and bounces its way through the element. What is so strange about this is that this is the only part of the ride that's rough. After the strangely rough turn, you plummet down the ride's first drop. This drop is not very steep, and it has no forces. It reminds me of drops that you'd find on log rides, like the Timber Mountain log ride. However, the resulting splashdown is nice, and while the splash is huge, it mainly comes out from the raft, so you don't get too wet. After the splashdown, you traverse a long flume section that turns you back to the tower structure. This is by far the biggest dead spot of the ride. This section is incredibly slow and there's not really much to look at. Finally, after what seems like 1 minute and 22 seconds, because it is, you enter into the tower structure. Inside the structure, some themed audio plays, but it's honestly really hard to hear. After a few seconds wait, you enter the elevator lift, which lifts you back up to the top of the ride, tilting you to the side slightly to avoid another lift coming down. Once you're at the top, you plunge down a curved drop that delivers no forces, into a turn that delivers no forces, and up into a mid-course with no forces, and into another drop with, you guessed it, no forces. There is a sense of speed throughout these elements, but it's not much. Finally, you have a sharp turn that banks you to the left before leveling out quickly into the splashdown, and this turn does give the smallest amount of whip. The splashdown is slightly more wet than the first, but not by much. You then have another slow flume section back to the station. Overall, this ride is fine. It has some okay theming, and the roller coaster section is a nice touch. This ride is great for families, and the elevator lift is also a really cool piece of machinery. Overall, I would say this ride gets a 5 out of 10. Perfectly average. After our mildly wet experience on Journey to Atlantis, we wanted to head over to the park's other water ride, Shipwreck Rapids, since we were already slightly wet. However, once we got there, we realized it was closed. It did, however, look like it was beginning to test, so we decided to come back later. For now, we would walk around the park, look at some more animals like the incredible orcas, and of course get plenty re-rides on Manta, Emperor, and Electric Eel. And, sure enough, a few hours later, we came back to find the ride open. So, we stepped into the entrance for this soaking adventure. queue for this rapids is very pretty, with some nice shipwreck theming and lovely landscaping. The rapids even flows underneath you at some points. We boarded our raft via the classic turntable, and our river rafting journey began. This rapids course is gorgeously landscaped, and the rapids get you insanely wet. There are some awesome pieces of theming along the course as well, like a massive boat. The part of this ride that's sure to get you the most wet is the tunnel. This tunnel starts out with an unavoidable waterfall that will get you drenched. And inside the tunnel, there are the strongest rapids of the ride, getting you wet like crazy all the way back to the conveyor belt lift hill that brings you back to the turntable. This tunnel is a very fitting finale to what is honestly the wettest rapids ride I have ever been on. We were incredibly glad we brought a change of clothes to the park today because we were definitely going to need them after the soaker. This rapids ride is excellent. However, I think the other two river rapids rides that I have been on in Grizzly River Run and Calico River Rapids are both slightly better. Overall, I give this rapids a solid 7.5 out of 10. A soaker, but fun nonetheless. The rest of the day at the park was spent getting re-rides on our favorites until it was sadly time to leave the park, as it was closing for the day. Content with our amazing day, we walked to the entrance, said goodbye to the cleaner fish, and walked back out from under the wave, ending our day at Seaworld. Seaworld San Diego really is a fantastic park. It's generally gorgeous, though it does have a few spots that definitely need some work. The park's rides are all very good, and the animal exhibits are wonderful. Overall, I'm glad to have spent a day here, and I look forward to one day coming back. Now, despite our day at SeaWorld being over, our day riding coasters was not quite yet over. You see, just a little down the road from SeaWorld lies a small beachside amusement park called Belmont Park. It's a very charming and historic little place, home of the historic Giant Dipper roller coaster. And that is where we were heading after our day at SeaWorld. Once we got there and parked, we walked under the coaster into the park. The park was free to enter, and it was on a pay-to-ride basis. I waited in line at the ticket stand to pay for my one ride on the Giant Dipper. Just looking around, you could feel the charm. The place was electric. Each ticket at the park cost $1, and the Giant Dipper cost 8 tickets, so it was $8 to ride. A little expensive, but not terrible. Inside the ticket booth / gift shop, there was actually a little museum giving some history on the ride and even displaying the old original trains. After I got my ticket, I went over to the ride itself. The station for the ride oozes charm. It looks so historical. And the trains look really nice too. The lap bars for this ride actually function car by car, not row by row. So when I pulled down my lap bar, the lap bars in front of me also pulled down. This became an interesting dilemma when 2 larger people sat in front of me. The lap bar for them was super tight, but mine was fairly loose. This was not a big issue for me, but I felt bad for the people in front of me. The ride begins with a left-hand turn into a dark tunnel with some turns that leads to the lift hill. It's a little jerky in there, but that's just a taste of what's to come. Once you reach the lift hill, you begin to ascend to the top of the ride. And I can't help but absolutely love the sound this lift hill makes. It's just so classic, and it's exactly what you would expect from an old wooden roller coaster. The lift also gives fantastic views of the ocean to your right. Once you're at the top, you begin a twisting drop. The drop does not offer any airtime, but you do get some laterals from the sudden twist. However, the pullout of this drop is absolutely insane, and not in a good way. This pullout is way too sharp, and the positives are way more than they should be. Not to mention, this is by far the roughest part of the ride. The jackhammering in this pullout is ridiculous, and my life genuinely flashed before my eyes. And while this is by far the roughest part of the ride, it is not much better for the rest of the ride. As quickly as the pullout began, it's over, and you're flying over a twisted airtime hill that's too big to give any airtime. The only thing you feel on this hill is jackhammering. Then you fly over another twisted airtime hill that's also too big to give airtime, while the jackhammering has not let up, before bouncing through a left-hand downward turn that gives some faint laterals into a hill that actually does give some. Just kidding! This one is also too big to give airtime, and it's just as rough as all the others! Then you go over a hill just like the others in the front, but it does give a very faint pop of floater in the back. So good job, hill, for being the first hill so far to actually give some kind of negative force. Then you fly through a turnaround that does give some laterals, and a little dip that does nothing at all. And then a parabolic airtime hill that finally starts to break the pattern by being too big to give airtime. But at least this one is just as rough as the others. Then you pass over a hill that gives airtime, but the kind that's non-existent, and is as smooth as Pico de Gallo. Then you fly through a turn that gives some weak laterals and pop up into the brakes. This pop is the strongest moment of airtime on the ride. Apparently in the front there is some weak ejector here, but I rode in the back where there was only very weak floater. And so ends your rickety experience on the Giant Dipper. Though I appreciate the ride for its history and awesome setting, this ride is really rough and fairly forceless. I ended up having a headache for the entire car ride home. The ride was still fun in a weird way though. I could not help laughing at how absurdly wonk this ride was while I was on it. At the end of the day, this ride's history earns it a point, and the ride scores a 3 out of 10. Most likely, I will not ride it again. And so ended my short visit to Belmont Park. This park is definitely charming, and if I had more time there, I probably would have gotten on some of the flats. Definitely not a terrible park, and it's full of the boardwalk atmosphere. I enjoyed my time here, but I don't think I will be coming back anytime soon. After Belmont Park, we set off for home, content with our day and ready for some rest. Thank you all so much for watching the second episode of Amusement Adventures. These videos are a blast to make, and I'm so glad you enjoy them. If you haven't seen the first episode of Amusement Adventures, be sure to go and watch it, and make sure to tune in every 2 weeks for more videos like my theme park video game series, Midway Games. See you then, goodbye.